Afternoon, everybody. My name is Dan. I'm a Jazz Shepherd. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 3. We're talking Riverside in the late 50s. And for my money, Riverside in the late 50s, but the 100 records they do here, 57, 58, and 59, it's probably the second greatest stretch of any jazz canon, next to Blue Note, happening at the same time across town, with Prestige being probably number 3 in that same era. It's an incredible era to be in New York. All the great players are there. Every label has a stable of artists that's just insane. So the sidemen on all these records is pretty unprecedented. There's only a few factors here for me that make Riverside a notch below Blue Note. And it's not the quality of the sessions or the quality of the artists. It's Warren Keepnews and Bill Grauer had a little bit more emphasis on repackaging stuff and making money, doing compilations. I'm going to illustrate that in a few ways here. These are all from the 200 into the 300 series, which is the modern series in Riverside. 8 Ways to Cole Porter, just a compilation of different artists doing Cole Porter songs. The Saxophone Revolt, just a compilation of various sax players on the label. There's great names on there. Mulligan, Adderley, Hawkins, Hodges, Rollins, Coltrane. So it's not like it's garbage. It's just not real sessions. This is a compilation of blues tracks, great artists, but it's a compilation. Just for Lovers, a collection of ballads from previous recordings and sessions. Blues for Tomorrow, Riverside Drive. They're all just label comps that are out there. They're always worth grabbing if you see them because they're never that expensive, but they certainly lack that driving force of Albert Lyon over at Blue Note, where it's just about, let's just document session after session, recording after recording of what these guys are having to say. And I can't really blame them. You know, it's a business after all. The other thing that to me holds Riverside back a little bit from being on par with Blue Note is the issue and number of Dixieland recordings in this period that all have great covers, honestly, and almost all of it's outstanding music, but it's not modern jazz, so therefore it doesn't really fit in with the rest of what's happening in the 200 and 300 series in Riverside. I have almost all of that stuff. In fact, I think in this series I'm only missing one record. It's a Dixie record I haven't found yet. And there was one record I was missing in the first part of the Riverside, which I have found. For those of you who said I need to find it, I found it. It's actually in the mail now, so I'm excited to get that. But Riverside, those things aside, is an incredible time in jazz. Let's start with the pianists. Evans Bradshaw has a couple records here. Great player. You don't really hear from him again. Those records are really not that hard to find. Wynton Kelly is the first of some more records he did here on Riverside. Player I really like a lot. Randy Weston, who's one of the kind of hidden gems in jazz, I think, in a way. People don't talk about him quite enough as they should. Kenny Drew does a number of recordings here at Riverside. A player that you're going to see a lot more from in Riverside in the coming years is Bill Evans. He shows up here in 1959, and he has a lot of great albums that come out in Riverside following up, but this is his debut where he shows up here on Riverside. They gave the great drummer Philly Joe Jones 3 sessions as a leader. All sessions worth seeking out, all from that late 50s era. Some of the great one-offs that we're going to see here. Benny Golson, he actually has a couple records here, but great stuff. Max Roach, another drummer record. Pepper Adams is a great baritone sax player. I love this record. I love everything he does, especially with Donald Byrd. And Gigi Grice, Jazz Lab. This is without Donald Byrd, I believe. Oh, Bird's on this. Great. Forgot that there he is, young Donald Byrd. That's a great record. A little more expensive than some of the other Riversides. Abby Lincoln does 3 records here as a singer. There's not a lot of vocal stuff in the early Riverside canon. That's one of the exceptions. One of the great stalwarts of Riverside was, of course, the Adderley brothers. And these guys make a lot of records at Riverside. And this stuff from the late 50s is beautiful, hard, intense, focused, emoting by these two cats from Chicago who, I'm a big fan of the Adderleys. I think they're a little underappreciated in some jazz circles, honestly. Now we're going to get to some of the horn players. Kenny Dorham, a guy that's on Blue Note as well, has a number of records here on Blue Note and Riverside in this era, and they're on par to anything over at Blue Note. Blue Mitchell, a guy that also makes a lot of records over at Blue Note, makes some really quality titles here at Riverside. Johnny Griffin, once again, from Chicago, makes a lot of great records at Blue Note, makes some really good records here at Riverside. Ernie Henry, a guy that died much too young. He has a couple of great records here on Riverside in this early period. This is just an incredible legacy of great artists. These are all coming out within a 3-year window here. All these titles by these great musicians. Here we're going to see a couple records by Rollins. And Rollins is all over on labels throughout his career. He jumps around a lot. Chet Baker, one of the great emoting ballad players in jazz. To me, he's on par with Miles when it comes to playing muted and playing the ballad and the slow tempos. Really has a wonderful, beautiful tone. Not everyone's a Chet Baker fan. A lot of people want to be hardcore with their jazz listening. This is what we're listening to right now. The version of Alone Together on here is as good as jazz gets for me. It's beautiful, it's moody. If you want a fog to set over your room and it to be a dark, dimly lit street, this is your noir soundtrack. That's beautiful. Chet Baker again. And then Clark Terry has a number of records here on Riverside, of course, from the Ellington Orchestra of the 50s. He makes some really great titles for Riverside. And again, he's kind of underappreciated player. Not everyone appreciates Terry, but he's a very bright tone. So there's a lot of great things happening at Riverside. Wes Montgomery shows up. He starts making great records. And he has a string of really great records at Riverside throughout the 60s. Another guy you can never go wrong with. But most importantly, what Bill Grauer and Orrin Keepnow was allowed to happen in 1957, 58, and 59 was this guy, Thelonious Monk. And when you look at the Monk canon from these Riverside years, he's responsible for single-handedly reshaping the shape of jazz, the sound of music in general, the use of dissonance, the use of melancholy, the use of offbeat rhythms, yet he always finds his center and brings us back to a place where we can tap our foot and always still find a groove. Monk is, for me, along with Ellington and Armstrong, probably the three most important musicians in jazz history. Ellington creates the compositional side of jazz. Armstrong develops the improvisational side of jazz. And Monk kind of distills both of what they did and brings down the avant-garde, the edgy, the discomforting side of jazz. He's the one who puts those tones and those rhythms and those minor keys and those, just the edge. Ellington does some of that stuff, no question. But Monk distills it into these small little pieces and bits and chops. And I sometimes describe Monk, he sounds like a piano, a cat walking across a piano keyboard. The notes he chooses to pick and he blocks and he chops them down. There's a ton of alternative rock that to me was influenced by Monk, without knowing they were. He's just that, for him, modern popular music doesn't really have the room to veer off in these weird angles and these weird time signatures and these weird sounds. And Monk kind of says to the entire music world, in the 20th century, we're going to embrace different. We're going to embrace weird. We're going to embrace the things that aren't normal. But we're going to phrase them in a way where they become comfortable and normal. So all in all, the legacy of Riverside, it's really high company. They made a lot of great records. They did have a second imprint, New Jazz, which I'll dive into on a mini episode again, just like Prestige had New Jazz, Riverside had Jazzland. And it's again the same thing where they have the different label, different logo, and a lot of titles will be reissued on both, which can be confusing. I think it was initially designed to be a bit of a more budget reissue label, but they quickly, after about 15 titles, started issuing new music on Jazzland. And I think somewhat like New Jazz at Prestige, a lot of that stuff was kind of modern and off the beaten path, but it's not clear as much as it is at Prestige. It's more just Jazzland. And I'm sure some of it was a tax shelter. You create a second imprint to balance out your budget so you don't have all this revenue coming in on one thing. I don't own a record industry, I don't own a record label, so I'm not really sure the mechanics and numbers behind it. But it seems fairly common for a record label to create a second and a third, even more. Motown did it with Tamla and Gordy, so I've heard numerous different reasons and claims why a label will create separate imprints for the same music in the same label. There's not really a difference between what Motown's doing on Gordy versus what they're doing on Tamla, which is what they're doing on Motown. So I'm thinking some of it had to be tax reasons for business write-offs and just different revenue streams. I'm not clear. I'd be curious to hear what you have to say about that. But back to Riverside, what they do in the late 50s here, they help reshape the landscape of jazz, along with Blue Note, along with Prestige. There's some cool stuff happening on the West Coast, there's some cool stuff happening in Chicago, but New York was the fulcrum. New York was the center of this universe. And what happened in New York mattered the most. And the best players were in New York. And there's some great sessions on those other locations, but you don't get that same degree of every session having great Hall of Fame musicians on every instrument, which is pretty cool. You pick up some of these records and you look at the entire lineup and you're just like, wow, those are all legendary players. And just like walking the halls of Blue Note back in '59, walking the halls of Riverside in '58 or '59, there would have been some amazing players, amazing young cats. They seem to fill a niche between Riverside and Prestige, where Blue Note and Prestige, where Blue Note we know had the paid rehearsal times, and they really allowed those guys to get into a headspace and start to really emote some really specific unified things as a group. And whereas Prestige feels very hastily slopped together often and without a lot of focus, pretty clearly Riverside's somewhere in between. They probably don't have quite the focus on these sessions that some of the Blue Note ones do, but they're certainly more focused. There's certainly more specific sessions with specific artists done to make specific sounding records. A lot of these sessions feel like they were one session recordings done specifically to be one record. So it's interesting to see the different aspects of what these labels were doing. Even the Dixieland stuff here in the modern series on Riverside, it's great. It's fun stuff. You can put it on at a party and people will dig it more than they might dig some Adderley or Monk. That Dixieland stuff is fun. It just is. It's meant to get cocktailed up with some bathtub gin and just to get soaked down and dance and groove and have a good time. So I dig that record. And Riverside was largely responsible for the Dixie revival that happened in the 60s, where that kind of New Orleans sound comes back. They start looking for the old artists from New Orleans and Chicago and trying to record them before they pass. That whole series happens, and I have a lot of those which we'll get to later in the 60s. But man, I cannot say enough about Riverside. They don't go for the same money that Blue Note does. They really don't go for the same money as Prestige does. But they are on par with Blue Note in most cases, and they're a shade above Prestige in most cases. And for my money, Riverside 57, 58, 59 is the second greatest stretch by any record label in the jazz world. And my focus is primarily on modern jazz from 1950 through 1965, 67. So there's stuff that you could argue from later eras on different labels, but I'm not super into that stuff. I'm not well versed on it, so I couldn't even argue with you about it. But for my jazz world, that move into the modern era, what happens in New York in the late 50s, it's just an incredible time in jazz. And these labels really are documenting it. And unlike Bethlehem, which was very much white cats, meant for white kids to buy, and Savoy, which was a real hodgepodge of, never really sure what Savoy was going to put out. There's a focus and a real effort by Riverside and Blue Note especially to record black artists and to give these men their voice, and to give them their chance to speak on how they feel about the world, how they feel about America, and how they're ready for change, and how they were willing to make change, and how just tapping their shoes for massa, like some of the swing cats in their eyes did, wasn't going to be how things were going to be anymore. We were going to demand a new world. And the militancy, the power, the optimism, the hope, the desperation, the even inferred violence at times. There's just a fed up nature to what's happening. And I think when you listen to what Max Roach does with Abby Lincoln on Candid, and you hear the Let Freedom, that dynamic and that angst and that powerful desperation, that's what a lot of this music is saying. Excuse me. So anyway, I appreciate y'all watching. Please subscribe to my channel. Please share it with your other jazz friends who are interested in jazz and want to know the history of the different labels. I thank you for all for watching. We'll be coming back at you next week. I think we're going to be doing Bethlehem next week, seeing what they did in the late 50s. And they quickly ran out of steam, Bethlehem. They had a great run in the mid-50s, in the 10-inch era, and into the 56, 57. But they get bought out pretty quick, and it's just they lose kind of that steam that they had there for a while. But there's still some cool titles coming out. I think King buys them, and it affects and impacts, obviously, what they're able to do. But Gus Wilde, he spoke in an interview years later how he was surprised that anyone cared about the Bethlehem catalog at all. But I love the Bethlehem stuff, and I love the cover art over there. It's been great chatting with you as always. Keep love in your heart. Have empathy for other people. Try to understand their situation. And jazz is about that communication. Jazz is about understanding what my brother's saying. Because I can't comment back unless I'm listening. And that's what rock and roll doesn't do. Rock and roll is four people talking at the same time. Jazz is a conversation. We're dialoguing. And I just heard what you had to say, and I felt some of what you had to say, and now I'm going to comment back on that. So listen to your jazz, dig it, love it, buy it, share it, talk to me about it, give me your feedback. I'm the Jazz Shepherd. You have a great night. Peace.